Hello all. In this video we're going to take a look at color representations, and particularly the kind of color representations that we'll use in OpenCV. These are it has very typical color representations. The default is very typical, but it also implements dozens of different ways of representing color images. And sometimes you want one of those others for a particular application. We'll talk about some of those as we go through. So I'm just going to switch over and take a look at my notes. This is actually like more extended readings that I've prepared because my actual class notes are a little abbreviated. So I'm not going to go through all the text here, but we'll take a look at the pictures and kind of talk through the main gist of the text. So inside the computer, we want to represent colors and we want to represent color images, and those two things go together. The most common representation for color images inside the computer is called RGB. And this is how most projectors and screens that display images, display anything inside the computer, they all use this method for displaying images. So it's the most convenient way to represent an image or a color because it can be directly then translated into what shows up on the screen. So if you looked really closely at your screen, like if you put a drop of water on your phone screen, don't do this if your screen is cracked or broken, or if not waterproof, but sometimes you can actually see these lights. If you look really, really close, this is actually a close-up of a high-definition LED TV screen. What you see is there are red, green, and blue lights right next to each other. Each one of those is a pixel's worth of information, and it will be used to represent a single color. So what we've discovered is due to how our eyes work, we will see very, very close together red, green, and blue light of varying intensities. We will perceive that as a separate color altogether. So how exactly does that work? Let's take a look. This is an image I got from a source that's talking about color theory. Color theory, by the way, is super fascinating. It draws from so many different disciplines. People work on color theory in the arts, so like in theater, with how to light scenes and the effects of lights on people, psychology, biology, physics. There's just a lot of work on how color is represented and perceived. What this is showing is the different wavelengths of visible light, from red at one end all the way down through blue, indigo, violet. You know the color spectrum, the rainbow spectrum, you know that. And what we're showing is that there are three different kinds of color receptors in our eyes. So we have rods, which represent which detect brightness, and they're what we use to see at night. But the cones that we use for color vision actually have three different types, and they respond differently to different wavelengths of light. So we have one that responds mostly to things down in the blue spectrum, and we have a green one that responds more to green, and one that is called red, even though if you look at the peak here it doesn't quite look like red. It looks like yellow or orange, but that's okay. We call it the red receptor. What people figured out long before we actually understood how our eyes worked, photographers and artists figured out that they could simulate color by mixing more basic colors together really close together. So if instead of producing something that was, say, at the wavelength of 500 nanometers, is that what it is? If I wanted, instead of producing light at that color, if I produce enough red to get my red receptor to respond about this much, and enough blue to get my blue receptor to respond about this much, and enough green to get my green receptor to respond about this much, that I perceive that color, even though the light that's being produced is not actually that wavelength of light. So the RGB representation takes advantage of this because representing wavelengths as floating point numbers are imprecise inside the computer, and they take up more memory. So it's more compact and more precise to use 3 different numbers, 1 for each color. So that's what we do. We imagine that we've got these sliders, a red slider, a green slider, and a blue slider, and as we adjust them, that changes how much of each different color of light we're emitting. And then the color that we actually perceive is the combination of those 3. So if you think about it that way, black is when we have no light at all. No red light, no green light, no blue light. So that's when all of the sliders are at 0. If we maximize all 3 sliders, we get the brightest possible light. And when you mix the colors equally, we perceive that as grayscale. So we get white if they are all on completely. And similarly, if you keep the 3 sliders equal and you slide them up and down, you get shades of gray. Okay, that's a piece of this. One of the questions is, you notice here that this particular slider, I picked this picture because you can see that each of these sliders has actual tick marks, actual values that it sets at. So it can be at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 10. This is what we want to do inside the computer. We can't represent a continuous range of values efficiently inside the computer. So we want to imagine that our sliders actually have tick marks. They go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, and then at some point you run out of ticks and you're at the maximum level. So then the question becomes, how many different tick marks do we need in order to be able to represent colors in a way that's natural to us, that looks like natural photorealistic scenes? So what I've done down here in this table is to show you what would happen if instead of having sliders, we had switches. So instead of having 0 through 10 as values, what if we have just 0 and 1, off, on, or off? 0 is off, 1 is on. How many different colors could we get then? So we'd have different possible values for the red value, different possible for green, different possible for blue. You can look at the combination of them when we can figure out what those colors are. So if they're all zeros, we get black. If only the blue channel is on, obviously we get blue. It's the same with green and the same with red. If we have green and blue together, we get something that's halfway in between, and the name for that color is cyan. If we take red and blue and we mix those, we get something in between. We would think pink or purple. Most of us would probably think purple, but it's actually pink-ish, but it's magenta. And then green and red together make yellow, and all 3 of them are white. If all we have were switches, so there's just 2 positions, off and on, then we can represent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different colors. And that's it. And what we have are, each of these, an on-off switch is what we call a bit inside the computer. It's a binary value. It takes on 2 values, 0 or 1. So here we have 3 bits. With 3 bits, we can represent 8 values. As you add bits to each of these channels, we call these channels, red, green, and blue. The red channel, the green channel, the blue channel. As we add bits to each channel, the total number of colors will grow. So if I had 2 bits for red, so that I have off, low, medium, high, full on, that's how many I could represent if I had 2 bits. Then each of these takes on 4 different values. As a whole, we'd have, 6 bits across the whole thing. We could represent 2 to the 6 different values. That's not bad. What we actually do, though, to get photorealistic is we give 8 bits to the red channel, 8 bits to the green, 8 bits to the blue channel. And that's 8 times 3 is 24. So you remember, we looked at an image in another video, and we actually saw that it was 24-bit color. That's what they mean. 1 byte per color channel, 3 color channels. That gives us 24 bits total. When you have 8 bits, you can represent 2 to the 8th different values, and those values are, in this case, from 0 to 255. All right, so I'm kind of going through that quickly, but fundamentally, the color representation that we've chosen is, just to sum up the main points, RGB is used because that's what displays use to actually show us images, and That means we have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. We have 3 numbers associated with each image. Those numbers range from 0 to 255 because we give 8 bits. That much memory inside the computer and no more. 8 bits to each channel. And when you have 8 bits, you can represent 256 different patterns. And we use those patterns to be 0 through 255. All right, I have a bunch of information here about that that you can read through a little bit more. So here's what I want to talk about a little bit. OpenCV chooses, for whatever reason, to write the RGB colors backwards by default. So blue is going to be our first, and then green, and then red. So I have a couple of examples here just showing you what colors look like. So yes, all zeros is black. Here I've just turned on the blue channel, so we get all full-on blue, very bright, but no red or green mixed in. And here I've mixed green and red, so I'm in the yellow vein. I also didn't go all the way to 255, so this is not halfway, but it's down a bit from 255. So you get this kind of dark, muddy green yellow versus a nice, beautiful, pure yellow. So you can experiment with this. If you go and find a color picker, I think I might have a link to one somewhere, but if you go and find a color picker, you can try it out and it will show you what the RGB values are. You just have to remember to write them blue first when you put them into OpenCV. All right, I said before RGB is the most common, but there are other color representations. I want to talk about one in particular because we will use it quite a bit, and this is hue, saturation, and value. HSV. A lot of color pickers will show you HSB, which is not exactly the same, but it's quite similar. So that's okay. You can use that as a stand-in if you can't find something online that shows you HSV itself. Hue, saturation, and value. It's a different way of thinking about how to represent color. It takes the first, it is also a 3-channel representation because we have hue and saturation and value, and each of those in OpenCV will be 1 byte long. But the idea is that that first channel, the hue channel, that contains all the information about the color, about which frequencies of light we're talking about. And so what people did when they designed this was they laid out the visible spectrum around a circle. So 0 is one end of the visible spectrum, and as you go around, you go through all the reds and oranges and yellows, and then green, then blue, indigo, violet, and you end up at the end with sort of the other end of the visible spectrum. So we've taken our rainbow and we've wrapped it around a circle, and then we refer to a color, a hue, by its number, the number of degrees around the circle it is. So you can see that shades of green are generally between 100 and, say, 140. And shades of blue are mostly between say 200 and 240, something like that, and so on. So that's the hue itself. We have 2 other channels that handle the change in brightness. So, all right, sorry about that jump there. I wanted to get this other view of hue, saturation, and value, which is particularly helpful for understanding the other 2 channels and what they're doing. And I had to go and find it elsewhere. So I didn't happen to have it in my notes. So here you can again see the range of hue, saturation, and values. They're drawn the other way around, but it's basically the same thing. The hue values start here with 0 and go around to 359 at the other end of things. But what this also can illustrate for you is saturation and value. So saturation has to do with how intense a color is. So if you're at the high saturation levels, you get really bright versions of the color. And as you go backwards, you get the ones that have that are kind of mixed with something more neutral. I always thought of it as mixing gray in. I read somewhere that it's actually mixing in the opposite color. But however it is, the color gets less and less intense as saturation goes down. Value is more about overall brightness. So you can see the low value pixels are all very dark. There are lots and lots of ways of representing very dark shades of color. But when you get to very high, then you are going pretty much from straight white out to super intense versions of the colored, depending on how the saturation and the value interplay together. But by and large, value represents brightness. So the last thing we'll talk about is color representation. Moving from color representation to image representation, right? So colors we've talked about are typically 3 channels. Most representations are 3. We have the RGB representation that we'll use most of the time, and then there's also this other one, HSV. When you want to represent an image is just a grid of colors. So it's actually easier to understand once you understand the representation of colors. So it's a grid of pixels. A pixel, it's short for picture element. It's just the smallest unit in a picture. It is not a measurement of size. A pixel contains a single color. So we have then, when we think about a picture, we look at it, like I have this little example picture here. We put 0, 0 in the upper left-hand corner, and we consider the x dimension to be the horizontal dimension growing as you go to the right, and the y dimension grows as you go downward in the image. So it's as if you took your typical XY axes from math class and just flipped it upside down. So each pixel here has a single color assigned to it. That means it has 3 values assigned to it that represent the RGB values. And we give the location of each pixel by its XY coordinates. So this blue eye that I'm hovering my mouth over, that's on the right of the 2 as we look at it, is at 4, 1. It's at X value 4, Y value 1. The other eye is at 1, 1. All right, so that's all there is to an image. If you look really close in at color images, you can actually see the pixels. So this is one of our pictures that we have in our collection. And if you zoom in on it, you can actually see the individual color pixels. But when you zoom out far enough, we don't even perceive those pixels. So that's what makes colors, that's what makes images work for us, is that they have enough pixels that each pixel is small enough that we just blend it all together and see a seamless image. I did want to say just a few words about grayscale versus color and how OpenCV is representing these as NumPy arrays. So when you have grayscale, that means they're only shades of gray. I said before that that happens when their RGB values are equal. We perceive those as gray. The trick is, if they're all equal, I don't actually have to represent them separately. So grayscale images usually have just one number per pixel, which is the brightness, the shade of gray between black to white. Black being 0, white being 255. So a grayscale image has width and height, but it's just one channel, one level deep. And that's how we expect, when we see something like that, we expect it to be a grayscale image. A color image in OpenCV and in many other representations has width and height, just as before, how many pixels wide, how many pixels tall, but it has a third dimension that represents the color. BGR in the case of OpenCV. So when we looked at the shape of images before and they showed up with a 3 as the third dimension, that was representing the color as a 3-channel BGR representation. All right, so this has been a quick overview of color and image representations, how they show up in OpenCV, and how we think about them in general. And hopefully this will be enough to get you going and help you to understand a little bit about what's going on underneath the surface of these color images that we work with every day. I will see you soon.